This is Chiaki Nishioka and Satoshi Nishioka. They are a brother and sister mangaka duo who write under the pen name Nishioka Kyodai, literally Nishioka siblings. And I think their work is sorely underrated, so I wanted to introduce you to some of them. But first, a little background about the authors. Although there's really not much to say, this is literally the only picture I could find of them online. Something we do know was that they were born in the Mei Prefecture, and that they were first published in around 1989 for the weekly magazine Morning. Or at least that's what this one website said. I honestly couldn't find definitive proof of any of this information, so we know pretty much next to nothing about them, which I think only makes their work all the more interesting. Let's start with their earliest work, or at least the earliest that you can buy. My anime list mentions a manga that predates this one, but I can't find the entirety of it anywhere, so we're starting here. Kafka. As the name implies, it is a collection of short stories previously written by Franz Kafka and now illustrated by Nishioka Kyodai. You might say that the siblings wore their influence on their sleeves in the early days, but they wore it extremely well. I truly don't think there's a better adaptation of Kafka's work. Their signature art style perfectly captures the surreal and dark tone of his stories. Take, for example, their adaptation of Kafka's most notable work, Metamorphosis. Unlike most adaptations of Metamorphosis, Nishioka Kyodai don't actually portray Gregor as a bug, something that Franz Kafka fans have been angry about for forever. Now, you most likely know the story already, but let's just do a quick recap. Gregor Samsa, a salesman and cloth merchant, the firstborn of his family, he is the breadwinner. The story begins with him waking up to find himself transformed into a giant insect, or more correctly,
Ungeziefer.
which more accurately translates to vermin, hence the bug confusion. With Gregor unable to leave his room due to his quote-unquote affliction, his younger sister of 17, Gret, takes care to feed Gregor, who now despises fresh food. Eventually, she even gets a job to help with the family's financial situation, leaving her less time to care for Gregor, and Gregor less cautious with his appearance, also less interested in food, essentially starving himself these days. One day, while the family is entertaining lodgers, Gregor sticks his head far too out of his bedroom and is spotted. The lodgers don't scream or react that deeply, but do deny pay for the days they've spent at the house, blaming the disgusting conditions and even threatening them with damages. At this point, Gret has lost all sympathy for Gregor. She outright refuses to even acknowledge the creature as her brother anymore, and demands father that they have to get rid of it so they can go on with their lives. Of course, Gregor was still out in the open, right where the lodger spotted him. He heard everything, and he agrees. He shouldn't be here anymore. He perhaps even thinks so more than her. He crawls into a corner of his room and dies of starvation. In the morning, his body is disposed of, and his family is relieved, looking forward to their future, looking forward to the future of Gret, who has now become a beautiful young woman. Now, obviously, a lot more happens in this story. This is just the cliff notes, as it is Kafka's most popular work. As you can probably already tell, Nishioka Kyodai have a very peculiar art style. Everything is flat, lacking any depth at all. The characters have these doll-like proportions and soulless black eyes. It closely mimics many of Picasso's surrealist paintings. I especially love the choice to linger on the family in that final panel. Overall, I think it's a great adaptation of a beloved classic. Next from this collection, I want to talk about my favorite art-wise, The Vulture. The story starts as an unnamed person is being hacked at by a vulture, particularly targeting their feet. We seem to have entered the story at the middle of the attack, as the vulture has already torn the person's boots and stockings, now attacking their feet directly. The vulture continues doing this with no sign of stopping. Suddenly, a man walks by. He sees the attack and asks why the person doesn't do anything about the vulture, to which the person explains that they of course try to drive it away, but vultures are rather large animals, and unarmed, they rather sacrifice their feet rather than their face. The gentleman mentions that he has a gun. He would just need to go home and retrieve it. The vulture would surely be dealt with if they could wait that long. The person isn't sure if they'll survive that long, but welcomes the help all the same. The man leaves for his home. "I'll be back as quick as I can," he says. During this exchange, the vulture had been still, watching the conversation between the two, evidently listening and understanding. The vulture leaps like a javelin and tears right through the person's neck. As they die in a pool of blood, a pool that's filling every depth, flooding every shore, the only relief they have is that the vulture is drowning with them. The art in this adaptation is superbly creepy, from the tall, gaunt figure of the protagonist to the way they draw the gnarled feet. Although draw is a bit of a funny word, it completely sells what the story is going for. This penchant for abstract and eerie art design would become staple, their calling card even, and it would further emphasize the disturbing tone of their work to follow. If you're a fan of Franz Kafka, I would highly recommend reading this whole collection yourself, as there are plenty of cool depictions of his ideas from the Nishioka siblings that I'm not going to touch on. Now let's look at my first time reading their work, God's Child. As this manga is pretty lengthy, I will be summarizing only the first 2 chapters. Besides, this video was more about trying to convince you to read Nishioka Kyodai works for yourself, as their stuff is better experienced blind. The first chapter of the manga is a monologue by the protagonist describing his birth in visceral absurdity, saying that he was born from his mother's asshole, describing in detail floating in his mother's stomach in the sea of acid and digestive juices. One by one, his unborn siblings are digested. He feels fear. It is the first emotion he feels and the only emotion he will feel until he is born. He attaches himself to his mother's stomach lining using the mucous membrane as protection and waits to be born. He is then excreted. He describes his mother as a black sun, his god, covered in blood and excrement, the god of revenge. And then he stood up and began his life to get revenge on the world. As a little aside here, I personally don't think this birth is meant to be taken literal, as the next chapter seems to imply our protagonist had a more natural birth than they're letting on. The next chapter, appropriately titled Childhood, tells us about a tradition in his town. If a child walks before their first birthday, a large ball of sticky rice would be tied to their back so they wouldn't leave their parents when they grew up. Our protagonist stood up at 10 months. His parents and grandparents gathered around to tie the ball of rice to his back, but he doesn't fall down. Someone pushes his shoulder and he falls on his back, everyone looking down at him and laughing. The protagonist doesn't cry though, and just lays there as if dead. He was raised as a girl until 2 and had never had his hair cut. His mother takes him to a barber shop, and while in the waiting area, he glances up from his mother's book, and the barber chairs had become executioner stands. One by one, boys climbed onto the platform and melted away into nothingness. He turns to look at his mother, only to find her replaced with an old witch. The witch tells him, "These are your brothers." He interprets her words to mean, "You are the only survivor out of countless children who have died." He develops a habit of playing with his feces, blaming his parents for failing to toilet train him. The pungent smell fills him with ecstasy. Sometimes he even eats it. After consulting a doctor, the parents give him clay, and it works. His obsession with feces wanes, and he instead becomes obsessed with making clay dolls, filling his room with them, until he one day smashes every last one. He describes this as his first atrocity. The year before he starts elementary school, he kills their cat, a cat that he loved. He cries all day. The adults try to comfort him, never suspecting that he was the killer. And then he no longer believes he killed the cat, and so he stops crying. I'm going to stop there as, again, I don't want to spoil anything. I think what compelled me about this manga the first time I read it, beyond the disgustingly gorgeous artwork, is the unreliable narrator. While stories with unreliable narrators have become quite common, I believe it's actually hard to do very well. Nishioka Kyodai nails this, as the protagonist has this way of both being honest, but maybe not exactly truthful, as it's clear he doesn't see the world the same way as others. Although, as the story progresses, he does become more truthful with his own, I guess you could say, neurodivergent tendencies. Not the murder, just the other emotional stuff. Even when he describes school, there's his lens all over it, making the story one that never questions what the protagonist does, but simply states it as he sees it. Very Kafka-esque in that regard, yes, but this is still original work by the siblings, and the writing style, while definitely inspired, I think it stands on its own as being a masterclass in how to write psychological horror. Lastly, I want to look at a one-shot by them, called The Dream I Had When I Died. I'm going to do this one slightly different, as when summarized, I feel it loses its intent, so instead I will be narrating the first few pages, which I think alone show off the one-shot very well. Ever since I was little, I was determined to die. When I was 14, there was no reason. Living held no meaning for me, so of course I felt no meaning in death either. On the night of my 14th birthday, I took a rope and crate from the shed and hid it from my school. It was a moonless night. Most houses had already turned out their lights, and in the thick gray air, the town seemed almost pasted on. Why 14? I don't even know myself. Perhaps I used to think vaguely that living out the childish fantasies that adults expected of children wasn't so bad. Not that there ever really was such a thing to begin with. 14 may have been where that ended for me. So I decided to commit suicide at 14. I arrived at the school. With no lights and no one around, the building seems larger than usual. This place, where children wasted away their lives bit by bit in the daytime, felt like the perfect place for me to die. Maybe I was feeling a little mischievous. I tied my rope to the school's iron fence and stood on the crate. Then I put the rope around my neck and kicked the crate with all my might. I felt my head jerked towards the sky. My body, though not yet having reached its full adult weight, understood its purpose was to end my life. I was still conscious for a moment. In the silence, I could only hear the pounding of my heart. While my heartbeat grew quieter, little by little, my consciousness began to fade. I'm going to die now, I thought clearly, and in that instant, I lost consciousness. Next thing I knew, I was floating around diagonally above my dead body, gazing down at myself. So the soul really does exist, I thought. I had thought this would be the end, but it wasn't. That was somewhat annoying, but there was nothing to be done about it. I had chosen death, So if this is what death entailed, I had no choice but to accept it. I stared absent-mindedly down at myself for a while. Not a single person passed by. The sight of my corpse dangling all alone from the iron gate stirred no curiosity, no emotion. Bored, I took my leave. I floated towards the classroom. There was my desk. Tomorrow or the next day, flowers would be set on it, and my teacher would give a speech about how precious life is, all the while secretly thinking, that little shit, what a pain in the ass. I was somewhat curious to see whether any of my school friends would cry, but I wasn't sure I had any friends close enough to do something like that. At any rate, I headed home. My mother and father were still asleep. My parents have slept in separate rooms since I was in 5th grade. I don't know why. Tomorrow morning, when they get the news of my death, they'll probably both wail in grief. They will probably suffer, struggling to accept the death of their son who had given them no explanation and left behind no final words. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel sorry about it at all. I went to my little sister's room. She slept deeply, not suspecting a thing. I pitied her a little. Still in elementary school, she would now have to bear the burden of our parents' hopes and love all alone. I waited for sunrise up on the rooftop. Anyway, nothing will happen before morning. I began to feel a little bored. How long had I been waiting? The dawn showed no sign of coming. Just as I started to feel a little uneasy, a black sun shot into the eastern sky like a ball bouncing up. An unspeakable terror came over me. I felt like I was being forced to face the fact that the night would never end again, that I was no longer part of that world. And these are just some of the works of Nishioka Kyodai. If you liked any of what I've talked about in this video, I strongly urge you to check out the entirety of these works and others. Whether it be through online places like thrift books, or if you want to try your luck at your local bookstore, or more likely your not so local bookstore, I don't judge. I just think these works deserve to be talked about more in the collective consciousness. Hey, so this would be my first video like this. If you liked it, subscribe or something, because I want to do more stuff like this. Talking about niche things I always wish I could talk about with more people, and whatever else I'm feeling, really.